All right, so welcome, official welcome to the start of our inclusive leadership training here in the city of Framingham. Definitely excited to be kicking off this 8-part series with you all. Our first 2 sessions will be focused on matters directly related to human resources and the diversity hiring policy. So I'd like to virtually call up to the virtual stage with me, my co-presenter today, Dolores Hamilton. She and I have been working really hard to pull together the practice of how we operationalize the diversity hiring policy that was implemented by Mayor Spicer last fall. And so we had our dry run, if you will, last week at a presentation that we provided for, Dolores, help me again with your organization name, my apologies.
It's the Mass Municipal Human Resources Association. So we did it for about 100 people, I think, 110 maybe.
Yes. No pressure there, talking to directors of human resources across the state. It went very well. And for our session, though, I'm telling myself to really slow it down because we're not going to be talking in any hypothetical or sort of top level sense. We're going to be talking about it in practical ways. And I know that this is a new way of working for everyone here who's been accustomed to the practices we've had in the past. So I did provide you the diversity hiring policy so that you can refamiliarize yourself with the language and the memo that Mayor Spicer provided last fall. So we'll revisit some of that language in today's presentation, and we'll go through the process itself, how we'd like you to enact it as we work to increasing diversity. And we'll talk about definitions of diversity so that we're all on the same page of what we're talking about when we're talking about increasing representation within all levels of our municipality. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. Because if there is a lot of information to share, we will be making our way through the full presentation and then addressing questions. So at any point that you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat so you don't lose it, you don't forget it, and we'll revisit it when we get to that point of the presentation. Does that make sense? All right, awesome. So just give me a moment so I can start sharing my screen. All right, so we are here to talk about the hiring policy standards. I'd like to first get us started with a land acknowledgement. Wherever your feet is planted this morning, I'd like for you to just become aware of the feeling of your feet on the land in which you stand or sit, whether it's in the office or in your home. Regardless, this land, it has traditional overseers, right? So it's native land that we are standing on. So just be with me in this moment as we acknowledge the traditional overseers of this land on which this meeting is taking place, as we honor this land and what it means to the culture and the traditions of those who originally occupied this space. In addition, I'd like to extend a welcome to any Aboriginal, Native American, and/or First Nation people joining us today. So thank you for this acknowledgement. I'd like to always, when coming into the spaces of these conversations, I've diversity, equity, and inclusion, I like to start with the land acknowledgement so that we're aware of the gaps of disparities that has us here today, even having the conversation of how do we implement diversity hiring practices, right? Because what we're working towards is an inclusive practice, an inclusive experience. And if we were there, we would not be having this conversation, right? So let's be reminded of where we started in the history that has brought us to this day. So what to expect today is that we will be going over just highlights of the hiring diversity policy. We'll be touching a little bit upon employment laws so that we understand beyond the need for implementing diversity practices. What are the laws that really govern the need for this practice as well? The value of DEI beyond doing the right thing. What are the benefits that we gain from practicing diversity, being equitable, and having inclusive environments? We'd like to define cultural competency because cultural competency goes beyond social identity. We'll talk about the recruitment checklist that will really be your guide to start to finish when you're thinking about the creation of a position, revising a position, all the way through the life cycle of the recruitment process. And we have handouts. So at the end of this presentation, I'll follow up with an email. What I would like to do is include in your guide these employment laws, because I'll review them quickly today, but you might want to take a closer look at it. And I want to make sure that the guide has that. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So let's get started with the diversity hiring policy. I'll go over this very quickly because, as I said, I shared it with you in advance so that you're able to just review it. But Mayor Spicer declared an official diversity hiring policy in order to help the city really embrace, enact, and live out its values and desire to celebrate diversity in the community, and with the goal to enrich the community the government, rather, the employees who serve all of our residents, and in order to have cultural capacity to do that at its maximum level. So the policy applies to all city department hiring. So any manager who's hiring when filling full-time, part-time, seasonal, or temporary positions. And the goal is to fill vacancies with the most diverse candidate with the appropriate skill set and motivation available from all candidates. And one thing we want to make sure we don't do in the process as we're looking to increase diversity is that we not assume that we are lowering or giving up our standards of qualified candidates with appropriate skill sets, okay? We have to be creative, and we're going to talk about the different ways to be creative because the candidates are out there, and it's about how do we create a community that is inclusive and an environment that attracts and allows candidates to understand our commitment to diversity from their interest level before they even apply. So I thought it was important that we also look into employment laws that affect the recruitment process. There are things written in law that require us to start doing our work differently. And very much like this policy, just because it's written in law does not mean that it's enacted and operationalized, right? And so we're reminded of these laws, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Age Discrimination of Employment Act of 1967, the Americans with Disability Act of 1990. These initially were the language to tell us to stop what we've been practicing and do things differently so that we can make space, we can have an equitable process to include all people. And so when we talk about diversity, the other reason we wanted to talk about these laws is so that we understand we're talking about a broad definition of diversity. So how do we make sure we have equitable process for peoples with disability? How do we be sure our biases do not influence and affect us based on how people's age, right? And of course, that discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Some more laws that had been put in place and that we need to be reminded of as we're looking to enact and bring this language to life in our practices include the Executive Order 11,246. It protects non-discrimination in government employment and in employment by government contractors and subcontractors. And so we are going to be looking at our procurement process as well. And that's something that I'll be working closely with Jen Pratt on. But so I just want you to be mindful that we're looking at this in a broad sense and very intentionally as well. Equals Pay Act, fair employment practices, all of these things affect our recruitment process to onboarding and getting employees into the municipality. Now, the onboarding and retention process, that's another component that we'll be sure to address once we sort of roll this out. So let's talk about the value of DEI. And let's start by first discussing what diversity, equity, and inclusion means. You know, in my practice in doing this work, I like to lead with inclusion. And inclusion requires or includes creating a sense of belonging and opportunity for equal and full participation for all. So that's all people who are, all people, period, but especially for people who have been othered based on their social identities and class. And it speaks to our efforts in removing hidden and overt barriers to inclusion at all levels. So we're thinking about even promotional processes and things of that sort. And it leverages diversity to unleash the benefits within our communities. And I believe that through inclusion, by leading with inclusion, diversity not only will be represented, but it will be retained, right? Because diversity is a composition rather of the numbers. So that's the representation. That's who you can see or not see, because not every social identity can be seen by our human eye, if you will. And diversity also speaks to practices and how we do our work and how we think about the systems and practices that govern our work, and which leads us to equity, right? But equity is not to be confused. It's not to be confused by equality. And I'm just realizing that my updated presentation is not the one I opened up. So I wanted to give you a visual of the difference between equity and equality. But aside from the visual, what's important to know about the difference is that equity is focusing on the outcomes across groups, particularly where historically there have existed disparities and unequal levels of access and representation outcomes. So if we think back to our land acknowledgement this morning and think to our modern day today, we know that there are groups of people who have advantages over others, right? Privilege over others. And so equity is about working to fill that gap. And the equity exists in employment, it exists in academia, It exists in healthcare, in many different systems within our society and culture. So, excuse me, some practices that we may be seeking to do that to some may seem unfair and not equal is really not meant to offer the same opportunity or service to everyone, because that might not be the need of everyone whom you're serving. Okay, and so when I'm able to take a break and pull back, I'll certainly bring up this visual so you can get that sense of meeting people where they are with their needs, that's where the equitable practices lie versus having equal opportunity, if you will, for everyone. So let's define cultural competency. Cultural competency, I stress, and it is a term that I like to focus on beyond representation or race or ethnicity, especially when we're talking about culture. It's the ability to think, feel, and act in ways that acknowledge, respect, and build upon ethnic, social, sociocultural, and linguistic diversity. Nowhere in that definition do you hear anything about my race or my ethnicity or being a person of color to deem that you have cultural competency, right? Or that you're culturally competent. We know that you may be a person of color and not have a level of cultural competency. You may also be a white person and actually have cultural competency beyond what others might presume or assume. So cultural competency for me breaks through all barriers of color and race because it speaks to our ability to connect within and across difference and as humans versus how we look based on the color of our skin. So this is a skill set that we want from every candidate, regardless of how they are showing up in front of you, right? Or regardless of how they increase our numbers of representation. We want to be sure that every individual who is already a part of our organization is working to build and develop higher levels of cultural competency, but we also want to make sure that anyone who is hired and onboarded into our municipality is able to demonstrate cultural competency and then has resources and outlets to continue building and developing. We'll talk about how we will assess that and evaluate candidates' cultural competency through the candidate interview process. So I'll pass it over to Dolores now to talk about competencies and the job description.
Okay, thanks, Maritza. The first thing that we're going to cover is the job description because it defines what the important tasks are that need to be done by prospective employees. The competencies define the traits required to do these tasks, and the cultural competency is the center of every job vacancy. Prioritize the competencies. You need to look at what's mission critical. This person absolutely must have in order to be successful in the position. Then identify what would be nice to have, but isn't critical. Think about what can be developed once they're in the job. Are there people who can assist developing and training the person? And what's least important, non-essential. Next. Okay, so you're going to hear a lot about our diversity recruitment checklist. Everyone will be receiving copies of it. The first part of this is the department, division, the administrative entity. Then we talk about the search committee and interviewing the search team. Key is who is the chair of the search committee. We need to develop our plan for the search, look at how we're going to build a diverse candidate pool. We will provide you with some resources in the handouts to help with that. How to select your candidate using an evaluation form throughout the interview process, selecting your candidate for hire, and then when everything's done, going back and reviewing how it went. Okay, Maritza, back to you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's start at the top. We're starting at the top with department, division, administrative entity. So you have the need for a position, or reviewing, you have a vacancy, let's say. So I'm going to ask you to review the recruitment procedures and modify as necessary, and implement improved changes. So what does that include? We have a diversity statement that needs to be added to every job posting and ad that goes out with that job description. We have the ability to shorten it if the ad requires a certain amount of words for the posting. And the diversity statement, it's a statement of commitment so that candidates who are interested in working for the city of Framingham, they right from the start and right up front, as it should not be added to the bottom of the job description, but right at the top where we talk about who we are as a city, we follow with our commitment to diversity. So at the onset, candidates understand that they belong here and that we have a place and welcoming environment for all. We then ask that you convert all job descriptions to using gender neutral language. So you want to make sure the use of pronouns are gender neutral, so that, and again, anyone who applies, regardless of how they identify gender identity or sexual orientation, they understand that they have a place here, and we don't preference either gender, or any gender, I should say. Identify preferred job qualifications as well as minimum job requirements. The approach in this strategy is we're trying to address the disparities in education. And so while some individuals have more opportunity to attend four-year college or Ivy League schools or what have you, others may not, and others may actually have on-the-job lived work experience. We want to value that as well, and we don't want to miss out on an amazing candidate because they don't necessarily have a bachelor's degree, for instance. So what we're asking folks to do is, instead of just listing the minimum academic requirements along with the years of experience, you would list the preferred, which might include a bachelor's degree and 7 years of work experience. But then think very closely, and you can definitely partner with human resources to talk through this and think about how many years of work experience would trump the need for a college degree. So that would be listed as your minimum job requirements. That way, regardless of how a person shows up, they understand that they still have a viable chance. Of course, the interview process itself will eventually determine the most qualified, but it'll allow us to fill our pool with more diverse candidates. And when I say diverse, I mean beyond just social identity, but also with diverse backgrounds and experiences. So then you want to review the job description or ad for language that might discourage diverse candidates from applying. Include language such as required qualifications. So again, this is speaking to the language you'd be using when you're setting up this preferred job qualifications versus the minimum job qualifications. And we're repeating it here on purpose. We want to make sure that you've been taking a close look and double checking to be sure your language all the way through is inclusive And if it's helpful, definitely share that with a partner in your department, or of course, human resources will of course be taking a final look at it for you. And additional information and provisions for requests for reasonable accommodations will be provided by each hiring department. We're still trying to research how we may legally become aware of the need for a candidate to ask for reasonable accommodations or special accommodations at the point of interviewing. But there's more information to come as we keep digging in that process. And then we want to review relevant exit interview information to identify areas for improvement within climate or entity culture that may have an impact on retention. So that's critically important when a position has been vacated. We really want to understand the ins and outs of that individual's experience when they were here to be sure we can address and improve any of their experiences, to be sure that we're not recreating or reproducing any poor or less than desirable experiences for the next candidate coming in. So once you have your job description, inclusive language, your diversity statement all aligned, you've determined the right level of preferred and minimum qualifications, you want to start thinking about developing your search team. And so we will, of course, need to identify the search committee chair. That tends to be your division head or the hiring manager, depending on the department and position that you're hiring for. So we start with that individual, and we need to define a number of committee members. We would like for you to seek diversity to be represented on your search committee, whether that's representation by gender and or racial ethnic backgrounds. We'd like for you to seek support in search committee members outside of your division or department areas. And even sometimes outside of the municipality, depending on the position, it may make sense to ask a community leader to serve on the search committee if that particular position will be engaging directly with community members or certain organizations. Think about the people who are going to be interacting with the individual hired in the particular position so that they can bring a different perspective, and we allow you to minimize the bias that happens in affinity spaces when you're hiring with just you and a couple of other people within your department, right? You present the possibility of trying to look for the right fit in a candidate. Will this person culturally align with what we've created in our office culture? All of these things that spew bias, having members and representation outside of your areas, in addition to, of course, a couple of people within the department, is going to help us produce different results than we've had in the past. So you want to communicate search committee membership and your members to the human resource lead contact. Typically that would be Judy in human resources. Judy would also be a part of all of, I say all, and I swallow because hopefully it's not too much for her, but we'll certainly address that if that's the case. She'll be there to support throughout the interview process as an ex-official member of your team. So we think about 5 people in your search team would be good. Odd numbers are always great, so that when you get to deliberation and voting, you have that odd number to help get to a decision. Everyone in the search committee, including the chair, of course, will be required to participate in our implicit unconscious bias training. So we're focusing on helping individuals minimize bias in the hiring process. It's not going to be like magic, having taken one session or one training rather, and then, no bias shows up. No, it's just about raising the awareness so that you can have more honest and open conversations with each other through the process and work to disrupt the bias that naturally will arise. And we'll continue to developing and implementing more ways to engage in that space. But for now, we have a training that we will require any member who's selected to be on the search committee to take part in. And we'll have this training on a rotating basis, but if there's a need to do one specifically for a search team, we can arrange that as well. And then you want to review the recruitment process and distribute relevant materials. So that may include the interview forms, evaluation forms, job descriptions, resumes, list of criteria that you are seeking in a candidate, so on and so forth. And then you'll look to select interview questions as a committee, and you, of course, will include diversity questions. There is also a diversity, equity, and inclusion or cultural competency evaluation rubric that will be a part of your guide that you can choose to use. It's not always appropriate for every position, but it is there as a tool if you deem it appropriate. You also will receive a list of sample diversity questions that will allow you to guide you in specifying the questions that will be used in your interview process. So the search plan development, as the chair, you're looking to be sure you can establish milestones and create a timeline for the search process. You want to think that all the way through so you can appropriately guide your search team through the process. Because you want to consider how many rounds of interviews you're going to be having, what are the criteria you want them to be looking for, so on and so forth. You're going to, again, make sure the job description is up to date before you share with your team. You're going to develop objective criteria used for candidate evaluation. So we do have an interview evaluation form, but in addition to that evaluation form, you have to make sure you've determined those lists that Dolores named earlier on. What are the have-to characteristics and skill sets that you need? What are the minimum? What are those that you could live without? And cultural competency will always be at the top of that list. And so you want to have those criteria available so everyone is clear as to what we're looking for, because when we get into it, trust and believe me, your biases and your the likeness that you have with the candidates, the things you can relate to, all sort of kick in and you fall in love with one or the other or not. But you really then have to stick to those criteria and evaluate your candidates based on skill sets and competencies, in addition to all of the other great things you're seeing or not seeing. Then you want to identify, so the committee chair, feel free to, discuss this a bit with your search committee team, because some folks might know of different sources for candidate recruitment that none of us have come up with, so it never hurts to ask. But you do have partnership with Dolores and her team in human resources and myself to find the best sources and strategies, and we'll talk about that a little later on different strategies for recruitment and diversifying your pool. And that also includes non-traditional recruitment sources. So we'll go into more detail about that in a little later. Again, you're going to identify those interview questions, and for consistency, you want to be sure that all candidates are getting the same questions. And one strategy for maintaining consistency is to also assign interview questions to committee search members so that the question is asked the same way for each candidate, and it creates for an easy flow as well. And so you want to also be sure. So we tend to ask diversity questions throughout the application process, but one thing that doesn't always happen is during the reference check is to then also ask the diversity questions. This is sort of a technique for check and balance. So when we talk about diversity, especially today, right? Diversity is the hot topic, it's the trending topic. Everybody wants to say the right thing and do the right thing. But proven in past practices is the best indicator of it replicating in the new work environment, right? So when someone says all the right things, we want to make sure there's a check through the reference where you also ask the diversity question of the references to be sure that there is complete truthfulness in that. And we'll talk later on about what's the term, people who embellish and how things are embellished in one's resumes and cover letters. So that's a critical checkpoint for diversity questions, not at every stage, not only at every stage, but also through the reference checks. Competency-based questions, I will pass to Dolores to talk about.
Okay, so we all want to hire our next star. So when you're developing your questions, you want to focus on the situation, the task, the action that the potential employee took, and the results. So what was the situation? What was the task that needed to be done? What action did you take, and what results did you achieve? Part of this is looking at what they actually did, as Maritza mentioned. What was their role? When we're doing interviews, often I find people say things like, I'm looking for someone who's a team player. Are you a team player? We don't want the yes, no answers. We want the answers that will tell us the situation, the task, the action, and their results. And people are prone to saying things like, well, we did this, we did that. You want to drill down deeper and find out what that person's role was. Next slide, Maritza. So these questions that are going to be the focus of, come right from your job description, be the focus of the interview, tell the details of a specific event, the action, the behavior demonstrated, and the outcomes, what the candidate did. One of the things I like to do when we finish a question is ask the candidate, is there anything you would have done differently? And that helps us see if they learned from what occurred. We don't want their opinion, and we don't want what the candidate thinks they would do. Next. The advantages of using this process helps reduce misunderstandings of skills. It helps reduce the halo effect of someone coming in and making a really good first impression, dressed impeccably, perfect for the interview. We want to reduce that halo effect. We all know you form your first impression in less than 6 seconds. We want actual examples of the candidate's knowledge, skills, and abilities. We want to promote consistency in the process, which is one of the reasons when you have a search committee, have the same person ask the same question of every candidate, because they tend to ask it the exact same way. And then we want to make sure that the key areas are addressed by assigning everyone a question that makes sure you don't miss a key skill. Okay, next. Okay, so building our candidate pool. This is something we're all going to be working on. We need to consider, there we go. What strategies can we use when we are starting with advertising? We all know networking is key. Are there other places that you can look? Some non-traditional things, such as having someone announce a vacancy on the Brazilian radio station, or leaving flyers at a cultural center. There's lots of other things we can do to help build that candidate pool. Okay, next.
I'll also add there's some long-term strategies that can be implemented to help prepare for the next vacancy. And so that, again, is in the networking strategies, focused on building relationships with different agencies, organizations, educational programs, and where the pathways, where are the areas or opportunities to create pathways for career development where we can start planting the seed early and raise aspirations. And we'll talk a little bit about the youth internship program that will be launched this summer, or that has launched, that will also help serve in that strategy as well.
Okay, back to you, Maritza.
Thank you. So the candidate selection and interview process. So we want to, again, when you have developed your plan, you would have thought through the rounds of interviews necessary. I think the level of position, the level of leadership in a particular position will help you determine how many rounds is appropriate, and the reach in which you want to move, sometimes even beyond just the search committee for the interview process. And that is something that we welcome partnership in the thought process in carefully thinking through what would be appropriate and most effective for your particular position. We want to be sure that you're reviewing and evaluating redacted applications and resumes. So what will happen is, prior to you sharing with your search team the resumes and cover letters, Dolores and her team will actually redact names and identifying information of each candidate to help in reducing the bias that occurs when we are reading applications. We all know the statistics of bias that occurs in just the names that we see in applications, right? You've all heard of the research that shows more uncommon names receiving less phone calls for interviews, even if they have the same exact qualifications as more common names. So we're working to try to reduce that. It's also a protective practice legally. And with diversity, when you're looking to increase diversity, setting a quota is not a good practice, because it might get us into some legal troubles, right? We're not looking to fill a quota. We're looking to close the gap of disparities. So while we're not setting specific goals, this process helps us in truly getting to the qualified candidate, right? And folks cannot say, oh, we lowered our standards to get more diverse candidates, not at all. And so we do still want to make sure that there's a short list of top candidates with minimum diverse candidates. So once you've selected and identified the candidates to be interviewed, the chair would share that with Dolores, who would be sure we have the minimum diverse candidates, just to be sure that we're working towards increasing representation and diversity. Right now, for certain, because of the makeup of our employees in the city, we are looking to increase racial ethnic diversity. We are looking to increase gender diversity, and in particular, definitely in some departments or divisions more than others. We're certainly looking to increase representation of individuals with disability, whether visible or invisible. So we'll be looking for some standard metrics, and I'll go over that in just a second. But once you've identified the candidates and you've been approved for your shortlist, you would then initiate the interview process. And so what will grant you the approval? So when you select your list of candidates, we want to be sure that you are meeting the diverse candidate metrics in one of two ways. We either want to see 30% diversity represented within your pool, or at least one BIPOC, so that's Black, Indigenous, person of color, and one female represented in that pool. So again, it has to be either 30% or one BIPOC and one female represented in that pool. And once you have your initial interview, if you're going to second round or third round or what have you, we'll check those metrics along the way. I'll say that and also say that there may be some exceptions. We want to make sure that we do this in a timely fashion. We want to make sure that you have the diverse candidates. If we've seen that all avenues have been exhausted and we still are not able to meet one of those metrics, that is a decision that would be made between Dolores and I and the chair to determine that we've exhausted all strategies and pathways, and there's an urgency or time has been exhausted enough that we may decide, okay, we're going to allow the process to continue still. But what still remains at the center of that process of selecting the candidate, of course, is cultural competency. So regardless if there's the racial or gender representation, that cultural competency should always proceed in the process. Okay, so it does slow down the process, but that is an intentional strategy in the process. So selecting a candidate for hire, you want to be sure that all of your committee members have an evaluation interview form, and in that interview form, they're able to actually score the candidates based on different areas. There's ways to also individualize that form to the particular position and skill set. But then, of course, there's your objectives of criteria, the competencies that you're looking for to help also guide that interview feedback. And so you will collect that from all of your committee members and work to deliberate on a short list for candidates that you'd like to identify as a primary hire. And then you also want to make sure that you're assessing the reasons for eliminating other candidates. Make sure that you understand why and that you can justify based on the criterias and the performance that as a group you've come to determine as the best candidate. Now, a successful inclusive process requires planning, patience, and intentionality. So we are here every step of the way. When you get to the end of the process, we do want some assessment and review of how things went. So we can improve the process and practice based on your recommendations throughout, for future hires. So definitely we will require that you then communicate the results of the committee search to Dolores so that we can move to the offering, job offering and onboarding process. And so in the guide that we will share with you, you'll have these following documents. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, the special accommodations request form is something we're still researching as a public entity, how it is that we can assure candidates who have special accommodations that we have a commitment to them as well, and they are welcomed in our municipality. And not that is the case, but we want to make sure that that's clear when folks visit our website as well. You'll have the hiring diversity policy again. You'll see the language for the commitment statement so that whenever you are producing your job descriptions, revising them, you'll have them readily available as well. You'll have a list of the hiring websites. It's not an exhaustive list, it's a growing list. And those, it also names the non-traditional pathways as well. But again, not exhaustive, but we wanted to share with you some sense of where we are. And every division might have a different strategy beyond what's on that page, but You'll then have the diversity recruitment checklist, which is what we just went through, but it'll be in one sheet, and you'll see the flow and be able to sort of check that box, if you will, as you go along through the process. We'll have a list of sample interview questions. They're broken up by entry level and managerial level positions, but I promise you, you may feel differently about a particular question, and it's up to you. If you'd like to use it, feel free. If you need to revise, add some language just to specify the question to your particular candidate or position, I encourage you to do that. So I do not want you to only take that list as a literal language. I just want you to have it as a tool, but feel free to wordsmith it as needed to be most effective for you in the process. And then we have the candidate interview evaluation form, as well as the cultural competency evaluation form. The cultural competency evaluation form focuses specifically on evaluating a candidate's level of cultural competency. It is a little intense, so I do not want you to feel that you have to use it for every candidate, but for some positions, it may be extremely effective in helping you identify objectively your candidate's skill sets in that area. But cultural competency is also part of the interview evaluation form, so don't feel that it'll be lost if you don't use the cultural competency evaluation form. So that brings us to our stopping point for questions. So I want to give you all one moment. And while I give you a moment to ask questions or drop a question in the chat, I actually want to pull up bear with me here. I think it's really important for us to be able to see this visual here in relations to equity and equality, as I believe it's something that is, it's two words that are used fairly interchangeably, and there is a difference. So this image that you see here to the right gives you that visual aspect of the difference between equality and equity, right? So all individuals are reaching for this branch, and in an equal process, we would give everyone the same level of block, if you will, to stand on. But if we're being equitable, we meet the needs of every individual and working to sort of fill that gap of disparity to get them to where they need to be, which is reaching that tree branch. Okay, so I wanted to share that. And then I wanted to be sure we also looked at the value of diversity. So what do we bring to our municipality, to our work environment by hiring more diverse and culturally competent individuals? We have increased satisfaction with work experience, right? We bring more creativity into our spaces. We reduce knowledge gaps in our work. Traditionally, you would think people tend to use the phrase our blind spots, but filling the knowledge gaps is actually more inclusive language than blind spots. But we don't know everything that there is to know, right? We're not all there's no such thing as an expert in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sure, folks have expertise, but there's always a knowledge gap. And the more diversity we have within our workplace, the more we're able to reduce these gaps because we lean on one another. You have increased innovation, higher productivity, more bottom line dollars, right? When if you're in an institutional organization that is about the bottom line, the increase in revenue occurs with diversity in the space. You have better engagement and intercultural learning, and then of course, better retention, right? So being able to attract and recruit candidates that you're not able to retain, if you might as well not recruit them to begin with, right? It's very disruptive in the hiring process, of course, but with more diversity, there's more sense of belonging, affinity in our spaces, and ability to retain our employees. So I'll stop sharing there. Do we have any initial questions? Amanda, I see your hand.
Hi, Dr. Barrows. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this. I had two questions, and one of which is I was hoping that you would speak just a little bit more about cultural competency, what that means. I think, sometimes privilege for us is like oxygen. You don't really know that you enjoy it because it's your norm. So there's that. And I also, this is maybe not for this session, but I'm sort of curious about avoiding the idea of checking the box. The reason that I say that is because I'm on the Mass Bar Association's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee as a liaison. And I've heard many now stories from attorneys who were in interviews and had quote diversity hiring managers say, wow, you check a lot of boxes for us. So it's not really a question, but if you could speak more to that, that would be great.
Definitely. Well, to start first with cultural competency. Cultural competency, I would describe as an ability to work effectively across cultures, and doing it in a way that acknowledges and respects the culture of the people that you're serving, right? So regardless of how you identify, you have the ability to make folks feel comfortable in the space, make them feel heard and seen. And once you're able to sort of relay that or transpire that feeling and that sense, I believe that people stop seeing the color, right? And they see that human in front of them. And the ability to do that it's not a common skill set, right? But the individual must be able to assess the needs and capabilities of culturally diverse populations. So it really requires you to do work beyond just what you imagine would be the right thing. You really authentically have to be embedded in doing your own work in understanding other cultures, different practices, understanding lived experiences of others so that you can empathize and really sort of meet people where they are. And when I see it in individuals who, for me as a person of color, who do not look like me, but can hold and be in a space that I understand this person gets it, this person has done their work, and then that engagement is more authentic and easier to have. It's an incredible thing, right? Because like I said, then the race sort of goes away in a sense that there's a different person talking to me, but it's more about that human relations. And again, it's not to assume. I think sometimes often we assume that because a person is of a lived experience or has a particular holds a social identity rather, that they too are culturally competent. So it's beyond your lived experience, it's beyond your social identity, and it's really speaking to your cultural intelligence, your emotional intelligence, and ability to work effectively within and across difference. So that is something that takes work, and that's not going to happen overnight, and it's definitely not going to be taught in your traditional educational and professional spaces. So I encourage anyone else who'd like to offer a definition or how you would explain more about cultural competency to chime in. And in regards to checking of the box, we are definitely not here to check the boxes. And I used the phrase check the box, but it was a literal reflection of the checklist that you'll see that allows you to check each step. And we intentionally, in some regards, we're asking you again, did you do this? Because we're actually asking you to do things like have gender neutral language, that you typically are not doing, or having preferred and minimum qualifications, right? In our society, we highly value education, right? And the where did you go to school? That brings a different sense of ability and capacity of what a person brings to the table versus someone who may not have, maybe they got their GED versus going to completing high school in a traditional sense. And so what we're trying to do is help you stop in the process to check yourself and ask yourself to think differently and be open to things that are not common or deemed as the norm in your brain or in your lived experiences. So this is also why we require the minimizing bias in the hiring process training, because we're going to start having you raise an awareness where we want to start having you understand that some things are ingrained in us through our socialization and that we're not even aware that we're doing and thinking certain things. And so how do we disrupt that and how do we do it differently? We want to make sure that you're guided through this recruitment checklist, but by no means are we checking the box. So when I focus on cultural competency, that's part of the reason for that is we may not always be able to hire a person of color or a woman, for instance, or a person with a disability, but we want to make sure that whoever we hire has the capability to work respectfully and effectively with people of all identities, all capabilities, and that regardless of how we show up, we're creating services that are equitable and impactful for all people within the municipality, but then of course in the city, we're serving everyone, all of our residents. So that cultural competency is going to be key. And we as hiring managers, as search committee members, have to raise the value of that cultural competency to its utmost level of importance if we're going to be able to truly create spaces of inclusivity and be able to serve people and meet their cultural needs, their cognitive needs, emotional needs, so on and so forth. So it's so critical in this process, and it requires a shift in how we are thinking about what's valuable in our space and in the ability to do our jobs. And we're trying to legally be careful also in this process. We do not want to violate laws such as Title IX, discrimination laws. We want to make sure that we're increasing our potential and opportunity to actually have more diverse candidates. And through this process, so the reason we want to make sure that you have a diverse, well-rounded search committee team is that we're not falling into that affinity bias, results where, because we're like-minded people, we're people of similar backgrounds and interests and ways of working and thinking, we are naturally, even if we have a diverse pool, we're still going to naturally select the people who are like us. And so we have to disrupt that by bringing difference and more diverse people, thought processes, experiences to work as best we can to produce different results than what we've continued to produce. I've seen it in my previous places of employment where we've implemented practices and thresholds that folks have to get through, and we continue to hire in the same way. And so we truly have to challenge ourselves to have that shift, to get out of our comfort zones, to be able to start producing different results. And it's our job through the partnership with Human Resources to make sure we're working to increasing that diverse pool, or your candidate pool, to have more diversity in there to allow you to get to that result. But if we're not working to meet a quota, right? We're just working to increase, and this is gonna be a lifelong goal and process. And that diversity, that representation is going to continue to broaden, and it's going to remain broad in the sense of social identities. So thank you, Amanda, for your question.
Dr. Trombley, did you have a question?
Hi, good morning, everyone. And Dr. Barros, thanks so much for the presentation this morning. We're doing this work in the school department, and it's great to hear this. I wanted to just offer up just a reflection too, is that one thing we're trying to do more of is we started some affinity spaces this year for staff of color to connect and share experiences. And I know that we're the largest employer in the city, and whether or not is any thoughts on your part, like is there a way for the school department to be a better partner with municipal offices in terms of affinity spaces, where they may have, there may be departments here that have a small number of staff and may not lend itself to an affinity group, a staff of color, to have conversations, but might there be a connection with the school department? Is just one point I wanted to raise for consideration. I don't know if it makes sense or not, because it's not necessarily job alike. That was one piece. And then also how the school department can be, you mentioned about like hiring committees. And I know that, for example, when we hired a safety and security director, the police department was very much a partner with us in that work, as was the fire department. So I'm not sure where the school department fits into that. Certainly we would be welcome to invite municipal folks into various interview formats. I just don't know, as you're talking about the cross division heads, I was just wondering what your consideration is the school department as part of those divisions and where we intersect. So we want to be a partner is the bottom line.
Yeah, absolutely. Affinity space is definitely part of the environment or practice we want to incorporate within the city or the municipality as well. Mayor Spicer, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I just said sometimes when we use terminology, we need to unpack it all too, just so people understand. Like I don't think you've covered affinity groups and what it means, and maybe to define what that is.
Sure. Affinity spaces are spaces where people who identify in, it could be based on interest, it could be race-based, it could be any social identity to create that affinity space. When I tend to lead affinity-based conversations, I tend to offer affinity spaces based on social identity. And then when it comes to creating a white affinity space, I remind folks that we tend to be in white affinity spaces. If you're a white identifying person, being in a predominantly white area, you're always in an affinity space, right? When you're in all white spaces. So we tend to actually focus on calling that an accountability space. So I offer that just to try to unpack that term so you know what that means and how that may be used. It is directly used to create spaces for people of similar social identities, but it could also be created for spaces for individuals who have similar interests or needs, right? If you create a space for single moms, and it can have a mix of different social identities, but that commonality in that space is that it's made up of moms who are single parents, for an example. I definitely, Bob, I love the idea of sort of reaching across the public schools and seeing how it may make sense to make that one space as a city, if you will. For us here, we're starting with rolling out the recruitment side so we can increase representation and work towards building those affinity spaces. I will say that Blake and I have identified in his space, in his division, DPW, to create and pilot a women's affinity group. I'm excited to pilot that to be a starting point for us to see how we may grow beyond that across the municipality and across divisions as well. So we'll certainly be making strides where we can, but we're going to take it one step at a time. In regards to the search committee, I think depending on the position and its interactions with public schools, we may certainly definitely be reaching out to your staff, your professional staff, teachers, or what have you, to support us in that process. Jim Snyder is a great example of his most recent search and creating a search team that went beyond Parks and Recs division. He tapped into community leaders or community organization leaders who would be typically engaging with the person in the position that he's looking to fill. So that's a great model and example to show how you can go beyond your comfort zone and your direct area. But I think that's something that certainly we'll put our heads together as chair, human resources, and even myself to determine who's going to be the most effective individual to be a part of that search. And then we pull together that training so we can get folks prepped. The great thing about that training, especially if we're able to get the search committees trained together, is that we create a space of understanding, openness, and honest conversation to be able to call out and call in one another and check our biases, check ourselves and our biases, and check one another. And that's critical throughout the process, especially when you get to the deliberation of the candidates. I hope that answers your question, Bob.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was just more of an offering of support.
Yeah.
However we can be helpful in any way, don't hesitate. But
Yes.
happy to be part of the conversation today too. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions, thoughts, feelings about this process? Anyone feeling concerned or nervous about the diversity metrics? Because I do want you to understand that as we're going through the hiring process, we may be asking you to take a second look, go back, and be sure you're finding qualified candidates that help meet that metrics of either 30% representation or 1 BIPOC and 1 female in the application shortlist that you've determined. I'd like to talk a little bit more about non-traditional strategies. So while we, of course, are working to fill immediate vacancies, we also want to start preparing and thinking about the next vacancy to come in your area, especially if you're working in a division that has minimum qualifications, it has certification requirements, or you're working with individuals whose English is not a second language, right? How do you find individuals that you can keep on board for a long period of time? How can you create pathways for promotion for individuals if English is not their first language, for example? There are different creative strategies and opportunities that we'd like to start exploring now. And so as I've partnered with division heads to identify diversity goals, we'll be talking about, and maybe it's not across the board, right? It's going to be unique and specific to each division, but what are there trade schools that we can build partnerships with that will provide career paths and raise awareness of opportunities that allows us to get the qualified candidates from the start? Are there places that we are getting qualified candidates, but we notice people do not have a particular training or certificate? Is there funding sources? And I realize that I'm saying this in a time of a budget crunch, but even for the future, we're able to seek grants that can provide the opportunity for you to provide a particular candidate who's met all the qualifications but doesn't have a certificate. We allow for 1 year for the individual to obtain that certificate. Do we have funding to support that to help fill income gaps or disparities to ensure we have diverse candidates? With English as a second language, do we have an opportunity to provide ESL or English courses to employees while they're working with us to help prepare them for that promotional opportunity, right? Because we know that it benefits us when we're out and in the community, being able to have employees that can communicate with the diverse linguistics that exist in our communities, while also providing them the opportunity to be promoted and be retained in the municipality for more years. So there's different ways that may take more time, but it starts setting the practice and the precedent for a long-term pipeline and pathway for diverse candidates in our pools. The internship, the Mayor's Youth Internship Program, the summer internship program that is launching this summer, that has launched rather, this is a great way to raise aspirations. We are going to be also having access to the 130 students who will be working with Mass Hire, and we'll be engaging them in an orientation experience as well as professional development days. So while we're not going to be housing all 130, right? They'll be working throughout the city and Metro West area, but we'll be able to expose them to different divisions, different career paths, and start planting that seed for city government, civic engagement. These are all ways in the long term and indirectly that we can start increasing our candidate pool in the future as well. So some other non-traditional methods could be more grassroots efforts, right? Depending, Mike Tassino and I have talked about different strategies for some positions in his area that would require us, maybe we're posting positions in local places where we know contractors tend to be working, and they can visually see this because they may not be online or they're so busy on the job that they're not encountering these opportunities, but they are always at a Home Depot or buying windows someplace that we can have our job postings so that they happen to stumble upon the opportunity. These, and of course, different organizations and agencies that create community and networking opportunities for industries to engage. Those are other avenues to think beyond websites that we're posting on. And I think you'll receive this in the guide or the packet we share, but it may be worth just sharing it right now as well, so you can see websites that Dolores and her team have identified to help widen our reach for diverse candidates. And so these are more, of course, general, and any position can go in some of these. And then there are some opportunities to have very specific, depending on the division, area, and position. And then again, we've identified some non-traditional strategies to be intentional in where you're promoting. Universities and colleges, it's not just your current students who would be exposed to those. They, as an alumnus of an institution, you have lifetime access to their career services department. So anyone who is thinking about a career change or looking for a job can certainly be accessing their university or college website, career website. So that's a great place, certainly, to post positions as well. And of course, we never forget the power of word of mouth, right? So that's why I named that. Even though you're going to be partnering with HR to really identify where you will be promoting and posting the position, advertising, you also want to share it at the first meeting with your search committee team and ask them to share with their networks as well. But that would not be the only practice, right? When you're only doing that, that's not effective. But you do that in addition to these other strategies that we discussed, and now you're looking at a more robust recruitment process and pool. Questions?
Dr. Barros, if I could, just on the public safety side of hiring, obviously we follow a little bit different process than some of the other agencies that we're on here with, where there's a test, there's a physical abilities test, there's all sorts of steps on the ladder, so to speak, before we even get to an interview. So you talked about, redacting of applications, et cetera. I almost find that impossible with us because we already know the candidates before they even hit the interview with us. But with that being said, at least speaking on the police side, how do we, override those biases maybe right from the get-go, right? So they sign up for the test. A month later, those who pass, we're going to have doing a PT assessment. And as they line up down at Bowditch Field, we're going to be making some 6-second judgment calls right when we see certain candidates. Regardless, right? It's just human nature. So how do I guess do we attack that moving forward? Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, that's a great question and great point. And I think it also it's the same relevancy to fire and their hiring process, right? And their process is even different from yours. I think I would take a step back and say that the diversity hiring strategies for you all would definitely, it's going to count prior to even getting them to signing up. What are the processes you're putting in place and practices for recruiting and even just attracting candidates to wanting to become a police officer? So you need a recruitment strategy plan. and you need a consistent one as well. And so we've talked about it in some regards. And I think we need to formalize what that recruitment cycle and strategy plan would look like so that we can increase aspirations across the board for individuals, right? It could be young people, but it could also be older professionals who are looking for a career change and wanting to consider a position with public safety. Of course, the redacting of the applications, as you mentioned, is not going to be applicable because you've already gotten to know the candidates, but absolutely the training, the requirement for the training is going to be one piece that we want you to stick to with folks involved in the hiring process within public safety, and I would say within fire as well. Because it's, again, that's one session, and that's not going to completely reduce it, right? It's going to take individuals to remain self-aware through the process and self-critical and willing to disrupt and replace thoughts and behaviors that naturally as humans we would do, right? And it's going to take a group effort to be able to feel comfortable in identifying and calling out these biases as they're coming up in the process. But it's just going to take practice and repetition, and we have to be able to create the space and resources for you and your hiring staff to be able to engage and stay active in that process. And so we can talk, we'll continue to talk separately to see how do we take sort of this checklist and these practices and individualize it to be effective for public safety, and I think for fire as well. So that would be my thoughts for you. I think, it's very keen of you to recognize that you won't be able to follow that specifically because you have a different process, but there are bits and pieces of it that we can make sure is implemented to help minimize and reduce the bias and help increase your pool, your applicant pool that's even coming up for training. And then how do you start to assess cultural competency of those who you are attracting, and how do you create resources to help them continue to develop their level of cultural competency and bias in the work. So we'll certainly continue to work closely together to identify those practices. Alyssa, yes. Alyssa?
Hi, nice to meet you, by the way. I haven't met you in person yet, so it's great to be able to meet you.
Same here.
I just had a quick question about mass hire. Who is the city working with as their rep for mass hire? I've been working with someone named Eric Fernandez, and I just wanted to make sure that it is okay to reach out to him, or if we're supposed to be specifically working with someone from that agency.
So are you looking to hire an intern?
So some of our medium equipment operator positions, I will try and send over to him as something that's more of an entry level position that we have available. I will usually send those over to him just to post, and being that they have a good program that works with the Parker Driving School, we'll try and see if we can get any candidates with their commercial driver's license coming out of that school that are partnered with Mass Hire and the Parker Driving School. So I just wanted to make sure that I am reaching out to the correct person.
So that I know Mass Hire is a big organization, so that could still be a good contact for you for the purposes in what you're doing there, and like you said, finding individuals with the criteria you're looking for. This particular program is for summer youth internship experience, where Mass Hire pays for pays for the internship experience, and we provide the experience. The new person who just started that we're working with is Walter Jovel, if I'm saying his last name correctly. What I can do is shoot you an email with his contact, and I'll also share with you what I'll do too, just for everyone else's information. I'll find the link, or if Ala's on the call, and or even Dolores, if you have the link with the work site application, you can actually submit through this link the job description. So what Mass Hire does is they will look at the job description and the posting, and then they'll try to find a match. There we go. Thank you, Hannah. There you just answer some questions through the prompts. It asks you about the job you're seeking. I know one question that tends to stump folks is about the pay. You can leave that blank because Mass Hire will be determining that. But they will then, if they find a match, they will match you with a youth intern for the summer. The interns are anywhere from age 16 to 21. But Alyssa, I can definitely send you Walter's contact, so you can definitely get a sense of what's the difference of resources you can seek between Eric and Walter.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Other questions, thoughts, concerns? Anyone willing to express how they're feeling, thinking, sensing about this new implementation and processes that we described today? You can, what you can do for me, which would be helpful, is complete any one of these prompts. This will help me get a sense of where folks are. I think, I know, I feel, I sense. Anyone? Oh, sorry, that's going to. Let me try that again. Any brave soul? Hannah, thank you.
I mean, I think it's awesome that we're doing this, and I'm very grateful given the problems with, and I'm not just talking about Framingham, but statewide with the lack of diversity in the municipal workforce. The thing that I sort of worry about is our ability to attract people even in the first place to apply. So not only if they learn about the job, but for example, if it's not a secret that government jobs don't necessarily pay as well as the private sector. And so, a lot of people with student loans, it's harder to accept these sorts of jobs. So I'm kind of hope that in the future, government is going to be able to sort of help people with that, and then to ensure that we truly get a broad, diverse applicant pool.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you. Points well taken and well said. Anyone else? I think, I know, I feel, I sense. Lena.
Hi. Yeah, I'm excited about this too. And, one of the things that we've always had difficulty doing is recruiting a diverse population of professional librarians. I think that for us, one of the things that excites me is the possibility of creating pathways to the master's degree. I know I can think of a couple on staff now who would love to pursue the career and advance or even become, go for jobs that we have available that they're not quite qualified for. So I'm eager to explore that and find ways to create that pathway so that we can more readily diversify our staff, because I know that it's great to have them on board in the buildings, but to make them professional librarians would just really enrich what we do every day and help us to reach our community that much better. That's just one of the things I'm thinking about.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Can we get one more? They say thirds of charm, so.
I would just add that I think we recognize everybody is in different places in this process. Parks and Rec has already had some of the training because they had a key vacancy, but we will be getting around to everybody so that everyone will eventually be in the same place.
And we'll certainly have to think of a different strategy for fire and police so that we can be sure all of your staff, your firefighters and police officers have the opportunity to engage in that work as well. We'll actually be starting Thursday with diversity, equity, inclusion conversations, a conversation series with police on Thursday, and on the 11th with fire. But that doesn't specifically speak to, we're just starting to lay the groundworks, if you will, the foundational conversation. So we'll find more specific ways to engage those who are involved in the hiring process with unconscious bias training. This session this morning is more of a technical how to do sort of training. Next, in 2 weeks rather, we will jump into the unconscious bias, minimizing unconscious bias in the hiring process. That session will be a lot of information sharing as well, but you'll certainly be engaging in more conversations and a bit more interactive. So I just want to prep you for that. And then when we officially launch the very diversity focused sessions on unconscious bias, racial bias, and historical legacies of oppression, cycle of socialization. We'll sort of do a build-up and allow each conversation to sort of lead us to the next. Those conversations will be a lot more interactive and have different mediums of sharing, whether it's through evaluations of case studies or videos, scenarios and different things of that sort. Will be in smaller groups, whether it's pair and share or small group discussions, large debriefing. So we'll certainly be hearing more of your voices, but I promise you we'll create a space in this group where we want to create a brave space, right? I can't promise you safety in these conversations. They will get difficult and they may be uncomfortable. And I will ask you every time, I will help us, frame and get back into this space because you're being asked to think differently, act differently, and we'll remind you to lean into the discomfort, right? If this were to be easy work, we would not have to do it. And we're working to really reverse a lot of conditioning that we've all experienced growing up in our society that leans on privilege, if you will, and produces cycles of oppression or legacies of oppression that manifest in the environments that we have today. So we're going to be addressing some ugly truths of our history. We're going to be evaluating our level of self-awareness in ways that we've never traditionally been asked to do. And you know, if this is your first dive into diversity, equity, and inclusion work, we're here to support you in that process. If you've been through these conversations before, I still hope that you'll be able to deepen your learning and understanding and capability to engage with it and across difference through our time together, because this is lifelong work. This is not, as Amanda said, boxes that we'll be checking off. And so we want to create space of accountability. We want to create brave space for honest dialogue. We also want to offer compassion and grace to one another, right? And we want to not be fearful of difference of opinion and conflict. When I say conflict, I don't mean that in a combative way, but if there is discussion of disagreement and we need to really talk and think through things, that we've created a space where we understand that we are all well-intentioned, and know that even well-intentioned people might cause harm. And so with that understanding, we are able to get to a place of understanding difference of perspectives. But I cannot promise you that in these spaces, we're going to get to a place where, you know, you will accept everyone's sort of thought process, or that you're going to get to a place of conclusion, right? We're going to be in these spaces that will be ongoing. The reason we wanted to engage this group initially is because we need you to start doing the work that we will eventually ask your staff and all staff members to engage in. And as leaders of our municipality, you need to be able to be a role model and a resource to those whom report to you. And what better way to do that than amongst other leaders whom you can relate to. And so the conversations we'll be having will require you at some points to leave your titles at the door, so we can approach these conversations from a personal perspective, and in order to be sure that when we get into our professional spaces, we're operationalizing equitable and inclusive practices. So we will be defining and breaking down terminology. There's no, dumb or stupid question. And I hope we can create a space where folks will feel comfortable and courageous enough to open up and share. Okay. Any final thoughts or questions about anything coming up? Saw something in the chat. Okay. And always, I recognize that we all have different styles of learning and speaking. So if you prefer ever to not speak out loud, but to text in the chat, feel free to do that as well. If you're in agreement with things, by all means, please show your reactions. It's really important, especially in a virtual setting, to allow folks to know that we hear one another, that we relate, or we encourage one's courage and vulnerability in the space. It's really helpful in building trust within our group. This is the safe space. Now, I used the wrong word. This is the brave space. But when I say safe, I mean, this is the space where we can say the wrong thing. We can say it the wrong way. And as long as we're open and willing to learn from one another and to be taught a particular thing, let's just keep that open mind and open heart, so we have that space where we can do this work and just improve ourselves on a daily basis. The goal is to just be a better version of who we were yesterday, right? So thank you, everyone. That leaves me, if we don't have any more thoughts, questions, or remarks. And actually, before I close this out, not to put Mayor Spicer on the spot, if you wanted to say any words to our group before we
Yeah,
take
you
off.
meant to put me on the spot. I'll take
As
it.
the leader of our space.
No, what I will say is, thank you all for starting this work, and we'll continue to work on it together. And quite frankly, one of the challenging things is being in this format too, because usually this is something that works very well in person. So I will keep my comments brief and say thank you. Welcome back from a long weekend, and also know that we will keep chiseling away at this one day, one step at a time. So thank you.
Thank you. And Dolores, do you have any final words as my co-presenter?
I think we covered everything. I was glad we got to talk about the mass hire internship because I think that will be really helpful going forward.
Awesome. And Alyssa, I will follow up with the email after we close out today. And thank you all. 11 minutes back of your time has been granted. And we'll see you all in a couple of weeks.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
everyone.